Good morning. This is the February 3rd, 2021 hearing of the Minnesota House Education Finance Committee. Remote hearings such as this are held in accordance with House Rule 10.01. This rule has been posted online and is linked to in our public meeting notice on the House website. All remote hearings will be recorded and live streamed by House Public Information Services. Members, you have the contents of today's materials in your virtual packets available to you, and for the public, these same materials have been posted online. Members, if you're looking for all of these items in one place, they are attached in the calendar event that you have that Ms. Burt sent out for today. To get on the list to be recognized by the chair, members using the Zoom interface have the ability to raise your hand via the app. Ms. Burt will place your name on the list to be recognized. If a member is on their phone and doesn't have access to the raise your hand feature, please email Ms. Burt and she will put your question in the queue. This is the digital equivalent of getting the attention of the chair or the committee administrator. An email from your House account with the subject line, "Please recognize," is all that is required if you're on the phone. Ms. Sunderland, would you please take the roll?
Chair Dabney.
Present.
Vice Chair Sandsted.
Present.
Representative Kresha.
Kresha, present.
Representative Bennett.
Present. Present.
Representative Daniels.
Present.
Representative Damath.
Present.
Representative Drazkowski. Representative Drazkowski. Representative Erickson.
Present.
Representative Feist.
Present.
Representative Jordan.
Present.
Representative Marquardt.
Present.
Representative Mueller.
Mueller, present.
Representative Richardson.
Present.
Representative Thompson is excused. Representative Wolgamott.
Wolgamott, present.
Representative Zhang.
Present.
And Representative Joachim.
Present.
That is the roll, and we do have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Sunderland. Representative Wolgamott, have you had a chance to review the minutes from our Tuesday, February 3rd meeting? And if so, would you like to move approval of the minutes?
Mr. Chair, I have thoroughly reviewed the minutes and I would like to move their approval.
I believe that. Thank you very much, Representative Wolgamott. Is there any discussion to the Wolgamott motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to approve the minutes from February 2nd, February 2nd, I was a day ahead of myself. Please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, members. Thank you, Representative Wolgamott. Members, you'll recall that this week we're spending significant time on examining potential solutions that seek to reimagine school climate and culture as a solution toward closing the racial disparities in education in Minnesota. We know that students having teachers who look like them is a crucial element to our school climate, and that Minnesota has a lot of work to do in this area. The Coalition to Increase Teachers of Color and American Indian Teachers has been working on this issue for years. First, before we go to House File 217, we'll hear from the Professional Licensing and Standards Board on their Teacher Supply and Demand Report. Ms. Bailey, please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony. Welcome.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for having me here. My name is Elena Bailey. I'm the Director of Education Policy at Pellsby. I also have with me here today our Executive Director, Alex Liuzzi, who will be happy to help me answer questions should you have some on the data I'm going to present to you. So I am here on behalf of Pellsby to share information from our supply and demand report to give you some data to contextualize your discussion of the Increased Teachers of Color Act, as well as to share our board's support for this legislation. For the past 3 years, the board has voted to formally support this bill, and we are particularly excited about the way that it would formalize and ensure the continuation of work that we've been doing alongside MDE and the Office of Higher Education. So I will share my screen with you, and I'm going to present with you just a few tables of data from our recently published supply and demand report and offer some context here. right. So the first slide here, and hopefully everyone can see it now, this is a depiction or a representation of all of the teachers who hold a license, currently hold a license, an unexpired license, I should say, in the state of Minnesota. And it's broken down by tier and by race and ethnicity. We're giving you a percentage here. I will show you the raw numbers on the next slide. There's a couple of important things to note about this data though. First, we have removed the life licenses from this data. So life licenses were previously issued, and these are mostly held by older, predominantly white educators. So we removed them because many of those individuals are not necessarily using those licenses or a part of that supply to enter the classroom in our report. But that does change then the proportions of percentages you're seeing here because they're predominantly held, again, by white educators. So that does shift some of what you're seeing here. I also want to make clear that these are licenses held, unduplicated headcount of individuals who hold a license, I should say, not necessarily individuals who are using that license in a classroom. So this is just giving you a picture of all the teachers that hold a license in our state. We offer this data with a bit of kind of a word of caution due to some changes that shifted from previous years in reporting and the way that this data appears. So I want to walk you through a few of those so that it helps maybe explain some differences you might notice from previous years. So the first is a change in reporting itself. So we get a lot of the race and ethnicity data from the staff automated reporting system. And there was a change in districts reporting where they were able to select multiple races for the first time, which impacted our change to now use these federal categories. So you'll notice the Hawaiian Pacific Islander and the multiracial categories. Those are new this year because again, we're using these federal categories. So what this means is previously educators who were, white are now appearing as multiracial. So we had one district, for example, where 150 educators who were previously categorized as white were able to select white and another category. So they're now under that multiracial group. So that does change the picture here of what you see in terms of teachers of color. Another thing that we have to consider is some errors in reporting systems. So we had one large metro district, for instance, that had an error in their software that reported all of their white staff as another race and several other categories. So we worked to manually correct this, and we worked with IT to ensure changes going forward. But because of that and some other smaller districts, we offer kind of a word of caution around 100% confidence with some of that data. The final thing with this is the first picture you're getting of the tiered licensure system as a whole. So you had in 2018 those extensions, which means data reported before didn't give you a sense of now that everyone is required to hold a tiered license or be on this tiered system. So what that means is individuals who previously were counted as permissions, so non-licensed community experts, non-renewables, all those were previously considered permissions and not licenses. Many of those individuals now hold a tier 1 or a tier 2 license. So that changes again, the shift here of what you're seeing. So all of that kind of to take away and say, we may consider this data and say, there are some shifts and increases in the general percentages, small increases in percentages of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers. But largely what you're seeing here is a change in how people are being counted this year. So I think that context is helpful when you're looking at this. I'm going to show you a slide that gives you the raw numbers in comparison to this, partially because when you see some of these numbers here that have, 7% and 6% on these tiers in contrast to 1.9% and 1.2%, that might seem drastic until you see the raw numbers behind those. So this next slide is the same set of data. This is the number of teachers who hold a license broken down by tier and race and ethnicity, but it gives you the raw number of those individuals. You'll notice that the majority of teachers, over 104,000 teachers, hold a tier 3 or tier 4 license. So when you're looking and comparing those percentages, it doesn't give you the full picture when you consider the actual numbers of individuals behind those. So what are the takeaways that we would recommend that you kind of consider here? One is that we would urge the committee to really consider this as you look at the Increased Teachers of Color Act, in particular, the setting of state goals to increase the numbers over time of teachers of color and Indigenous teachers in classrooms, that you really have a discussion of what that looks like. Is that teachers who hold that full professional license of a tier 3 or tier 4? Is it teachers who hold any license? So that's something we would urge further discussion on. And then what we've seen, not in these tables, but in our supply and demand report, is that whatever minor increases we have in licenses in terms of teachers of color is largely offset, well, not largely, is entirely offset by issues of retention. And so something that we have proposed and would urge the committee and others to consider is a teacher survey that would alternate with the supply and demand report. Because this data, as we mentioned, comes from licensing applications and district reporting. So we don't have that direct data from teachers to say, what's your school climate like? Why are you staying? Why are you leaving? So we are proposing something that would alternate with the supply and demand report to give us more information on questions of retention and to deal with our attrition rates. So those would be some of those takeaways. The last slide that I'd like to show you is the proportion of teachers of color in contrast or comparison to students of color and Indigenous students. So this table, this data comes again from district data. So this is based off of assignment, meaning districts reporting who is working in their school, in their classrooms. A caution or a note about these numbers here is when you see that 5,497, that number may be duplicated across a district. So you might have an individual who is working in multiple districts if they're teaching, art here and in another district, or even across regions if they're in overlapping areas. So it's not unduplicated. So the best way to think about this with that 7.28% is that teachers of color and Indigenous teachers represent a little over 7% of assignments held in the state, not that they represent 7% of teachers in classrooms. So it's not an unduplicated headcount here. But again, the bigger takeaway is when you contrast those percentages to students of color and Indigenous students, we still have a gross disparity in the teachers that are filling our classrooms in contrast to the students. So that disparity is still there, which is something that I hope you'll consider as you look through it and the different kind of proposals in the Increased Teachers of Color Act to deal with that disparity. The last thing I'd like to share with you is just in relation to all that data that I've given you today, a few provisions in the Increased Teachers of Color Act that we are particularly supportive of that we think would help to look at some of the gaps in data that you noticed, right, in terms of the disparities between teachers of color and students of color and the issue of retention. So our board is very supportive of the measures that would support teacher preparation in terms of the Grow Your Own programs, in terms of the Collaborative Urban and Greater Minnesota Educators of Color Grant. We're also very supportive of proposals to remove testing barriers. So our board has proposed moving content and pedagogy to tier 4 and removing basic skills, but our board also voted to support ITCA's stronger measures because of the research out there that shows that this isn't necessarily an effective measure of quality. Finally, when it comes to retention and not just getting those teachers of color and Indigenous teachers in the field, but keeping them there, the mentorship programs and grants, efforts to improve school climate through cultural competency, and curriculum changes that emphasize ethnic studies, heritage language programs are all measures that we are supportive that, again, would think they would help us meet that larger state goal. So I'll end there, and then I think Alex and I are happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. We do have questions from at least one committee member. Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Bailey, for your presentation. I have several questions. The first one is, why is the label where you have used numbers to delineate the tiers still reading permission holders when we don't have permission holders anymore?
Ms. Bailey, maybe if you could flip back to that slide. Is that possible?
All right, hopefully, Mr. Chair, members of the committee can see that. Yes?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chair, Representative Erickson, that's a great question. To be fair, we took this table from the supply and demand report, which does include permissions, but you're right, the data we're showing here, we didn't include those. So by permissions, we mean out of field permissions and innovative program permissions. So we still issue permissions, but I did not include those in here, so I should have removed that from that. Great catch.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you for that correction. My second question is, you talk about supporting House File 217, which is going to be heard in this committee shortly, but you already heard it in policy. So your remarks about the goals that are set and the question as to whether we should be discussing whether teachers go for full professional, which I take umbrage to because all of the tier licenses are professional. But why would you be raising that issue for us to discuss? Isn't that a decision that's made by an individual seeking a license? And especially if they're beginners moving into the system with their bachelor's of arts and a request from a district to hire them, that would be a decision that that candidate or that person would make?
Ms. Bailey.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative Erickson, thank you for that question. To clarify, you'll hear and you'll discuss later today, there's a proposal to establish a state kind of target of increasing teachers of color by a certain percentage, each year. And so we just are urging some more clarification around, is that target to increase people who hold a license like a tier 3 or tier 4 that can move from district to district, that is renewable without limitation, or is it to just increase teachers of color who hold any tiered license? That is absolutely a discussion for you all as legislators to have, not us to tell you what to do there. We just were urging some more discussion in that regard.
Thank
Representative
you.
Erickson.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Chair. Another question for Ms. Bailey. Can't Pellsby do a survey on their own without asking the legislature to require a survey? And this is your statement on retention.
Ms. Bailey.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative Erickson, another excellent question. We have been trying to get the survey up and running, and I'm sure Alex may be able to speak to the budget aspect a little bit more. But it's my understanding that the time and the effort and the financial aspect of that has been something we haven't been able to do yet, but it is something our board has been supportive of. And as soon as we can, we would like to do that. It's just been a matter of those aspects. Maybe, Mr. Chair, I don't know if you'd like Alex to speak to that a little bit as well.
Ms. Luigi, you want in?
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Alex Liuzzi. I'm the Executive Director of the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board. Just to reiterate Ms. Bailey's point, we have been attempting. It does appear that to do a report of that level would be approximately $50,000, which on a smaller budget with 22 staff, that would be a little bit more challenging for us. We continue to look at next fiscal year as a possibility. As you know, we've been working diligently with our IT system. So all additional funds have had to go to our IT work, but hopefully in years to come, if it's not become a legislative priority, hopefully we could pull some of that out of our budget as well to do that survey. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Luigi, good to see you, having worked with you many years. What is the objection to getting rid of testing? I know I heard Ms. Bailey say that it is not a measure, but isn't that an insult to our profession to say to them a pedagogy and a content test is not necessary because it doesn't prove anything? I mean, would you comment on, as a board executive director, why a board would discuss an issue like this from that perspective?
Mr. Luigi.
Mr. Chair, Representative Erickson, thank you for the question. We've been having a lot of discussions recently about what the data shows us as a barrier for teachers of color specifically, which is why we're addressing it here. Nationally, and Ms. Bailey's been wonderful, or Dr. Bailey, I should say, has been wonderful in her research in this area for our agency, specifically with the skills exam showing that it does not have a relationship to efficacy as a teacher for the skills exam. So for the board's proposal this year, in looking at our Tier 2 data and at the requirements for tiered licensure, our recommendation is that the skills exam be removed from a Tier 4 and that the content and the pedagogy exams move to Tier 4 instead of being that barrier for a Tier 3. What we've seen is that 38% of our Tier 2 teachers have completed teacher preparation. They're just individuals for some reason or another have not been able to pass the content or the pedagogy skills. And the data that we're hoping to pull for the board in the next few months, we're currently in the RFP process for a testing vendor for the next 5 years. So we're waiting for that process to finish. We want to look at what those scores are and what the demographic passing rates are for those exams. We have, as a board, have always considered the content and pedagogy exam one of many measures that are used to assess how a teacher's professional development. We think teacher preparation is extremely important. We also now have the EdTPA as a performance assessment that's used as a measure for teacher preparation providers. So we think there's lots of tools out there now to consider many more ways that might not be as much of a barrier, but still be able to more effectively measure efficacy in the classroom.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, Mr. Luigi, isn't the onus on the teacher preparation programs, though, when it comes to whether or not a candidate has the content, and this is very basic content for that particular subject area or areas, you know, as an elementary, it's different from high school. Isn't that responsibility for both content and pedagogy on those teacher ed programs?
Mr. Luigi.
Mr. Chair, Representative Erickson, it is actually, and in statute, there is that teacher preparation providers are required to give supports to their candidates who haven't passed those exams. So the onus is on them for that support, but I would let teacher prep providers speak to you. Both now we have, as you're all aware, many 4 alternative pathways in the state. Let representatives of those institutions and organizations speak to the supports that they have provided and still the barriers that they see teachers face with those exams, even when they have extreme preparation in the content and the pedagogy, still having struggles with those exams for multiple reasons.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you. Final question, Mr. Luigi. Is the tier system working?
Mr. Luigi.
Mr. Chair, Representative Erickson, whoa, that's a broad question.
You bet it is.
Here's what I would say. The licensure system that we had before tiered licensure was extremely unclear. And having clarity in how teachers can access becoming a teacher has been extremely helpful. Understanding how to move up those tiers has been extremely helpful. As legislators worked on the details of what's within each tier, they're added some significant complexity, specifically within renewing of tiers, and that tier 2 license has had some extreme confusion and complexity within it. So we do have some recommendations this year that we're bringing forward that we believe are some technical changes that would specifically help out-of-state teachers, specifically help teachers in Minnesota with some of the barriers that they've seen in there. For example, a tier 4 individual must have 3 years of teaching in Minnesota. We believe that we could help streamline out-of-state teachers if we allowed that 3 years to be in any state. So there's a few minor things that we think could help tiered licensure, but in general, what we have seen with the data, and again, this is only the first year of data that we have of full transition to tiered licensure, because every license was extended for a year. So this is our first full year. It looks like the non-licensed community expert and some of the other license types have effectively moved to that tier 1 and tier 2 and have helped districts meet some of that need that they've had there. Now we just need to help make sure that it's clear and that we haven't put up any unnecessary barriers when we moved into tiered licensure.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Luigi, are those the proposals brought forth in House File 217? Those changes to which you were just referring?
Mr. Luigi.
Mr. Chair, Representative Erickson, thank you for that clarification. They are not. This is not our bill. We are just speaking to the data related to this bill, Pellsby has separate proposals that we hope will be heard at a different time.
Thank you, Mr.
Representative
Chair,
Erickson?
and thank you, Mr. Luigi.
Any other questions from members for either Dr. Bailey or Ms. Luigi? Seeing none, thank you both for your time. And Dr. Bailey, members may not be aware, is the author of How the Streets Were Made, Housing Segregation and Black Life in America, which is a nominee for a Minnesota Book Award this year. That's fantastic. I took a few minutes, I checked out the book. It looks like some pretty heady but insightful stuff. So I may just have to order a copy from my local independent bookstore. Congratulations on the publication and the nomination. Good luck with that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.